physics. From her doctorate, her life took her on a spiritual journey where she's now a spiritual leader and writer. George Angus and Sharon met in Albuquerque at Richard Raw's living school, and George and his wife also have a retreat center called the Restory Retreat Centre, and Sharon at her Solitude Retreat Centre, and George and Matilda collaborate together. And we missed a retreat with them this year in August. So hopefully lots of us can meet there next year in August. George, interesting person. A mechanical engineer, a carpenter, a farmer, a multi-skilled man, just like Jesus. He did spiritual direction at the Jesuit Institute and started as a Dutch Reformed minister. So how's that for ecumenism? After the living school, his contemplative living is now a vessel where he and his wife live their lives. So welcome to Sharon and George. And I'll hand over to you now, Sharon.
Thank you, Bunny, and thank you, everybody. It's been wonderful to see so many familiar faces and also new faces. It's a great privilege to be here with all of you, gathered in this virtual space at this very strange time in our lives that feels like a bit of a thin liminal space, where we're all searching for meaning now more than ever. And it feels like we're being invited to respond to the invitation to go deeper. And this invitation is ongoing, to go ever deeper. And I want to quote the Jewish mystic Etty Hillesum, who Larry Kaufman introduced me to, the speaker at the previous Coffee with God conversations. And she wrote, "There's a really deep well inside of me, and in it dwells God. Sometimes I'm there too, but more often stones and grit block the well, and God is buried beneath. Then he must be dug out again." And this is essentially what my book is about, this deepening journey into the inner well, the presence of God, who dwells deep within us, buried underneath the grit and rubble of our busy lives. And I call this journey contemplative living. And this is what I explore in the book, coming at it from a number of different angles. But essentially, my hope is that it will guide the reader in exploring ways of being grounded in an inner knowing and relational connection with the immediacy of God's presence, and ways of becoming clear, open channels for this living water to flow from this inner world through us into a world that's so desperately thirsting for freedom, authenticity, and true compassion. Many of us have an indescribable longing for something deeper, and we have a hunch that there must be a richly textured beauty and meaning to our lives. But sometimes it feels just beyond our reach. And we may have had tastes of this, you know, in those moments where we feel like we've brushed up against the sacred, perhaps in that moment of catching our breath at the quiet immensity of the Drakensberg, or a momentary awareness of the hush that seems to hold us as we walk through the mossy undergrowth of an indigenous forest, or enter a quiet candlelit church, or even simply the yearning that we feel that in itself seems to carry the hint of the beauty we long for. The perfumed traces of divine presence that seems to linger in the cadences of our longing. As a teenager, one of my favorite things to do late at night during full moon was to sit with a curtain around my bed, enclosing myself in a private space in the bedroom that I shared with my sister. And almost like a sacred ritual, I would slowly peel open my Wilson's toffees and chew them while watching the full moon. And in those moments of solitude, I remember feeling an immense longing flowing through me. And this longing has been a regular companion of mine through my life, and has been the tug that has drawn me into a quest for a deeper dimension than the obvious narrative that I was given by school or church or society about what my life should be about. And this is the tug that drew me to explore contemplative spirituality, and that compelled me to leave my position at the university and start a retreat center in the quest to explore and share this mysterious journey of silence with others. In exploring the deeper contemplative dimension of life, I've discovered a rich and textured inner landscape, more vast and adventurous than I'd expected. And I've stumbled across an urge in myself to share this exploration with others. And this is how this book has come to be born. So let me talk a little bit about behind the process behind the writing. When I started out on this contemplative journey in my mid-20s, I really struggled to find accessible material to guide me into this new terrain. And I remember sitting in quiet prayer on retreats, trying to fathom what I was supposed to be doing during this time. And I also felt like my life was a sea of confusing and troubling emotions, knee-jerk reactions, and sometimes devastating mistakes. And as I've stumbled along on this journey, I've found some wonderful gems. There's some incredible stuff out there, and amazing wisdom teachers, and a depth to the gospel that I never knew was there. I've also found the person of Jesus to be a luminary of profound, life-changing wisdom and grace. And I've discovered very helpful pointers that have guided me in exploring my complex inner terrain. And so, being a physics teacher, my mind naturally goes into wanting to share these explorations in ways that are accessible and helpful to others who are on a similar journey. And so that's what my mind is constantly doing. This is one of the temptations I actually have to deal with during my prayers, is to not keep going into those explanatory loops. But in the book, I explore a range of contemplative practices that facilitate our awakening to the richness of this inner landscape and to the immediacy of the presence of God. And so I thought I'd just highlight 3 of these practices today, just to give you a taste of how I explore these. And these are, the 3 are presence, self-compassion, and participation. Presence, it's of fundamental importance if we are to wake up in any way from the virtual reality that our minds are spinning, the kind of self-reinforcing cycles that we all must be well aware of during this COVID crisis. Round and round it goes. And we need to wake up from this and begin to have a more authentic experience of our lives and deepen our meaningful engagement with the world around us. And all wisdom traditions teach about the importance of presence, precisely because it is our lack of presence that keeps us from recognizing the beauty that surrounds us, but instead keeps us trapped in the stories that our minds are constantly weaving. And neurobiology, it's fascinating negative spin on them than the reality. Also, if you notice your mind's activity for a while, it's quite interesting to just sit and watch what it gets up to. It's always regurgitating the past or anticipating the future. And it's always self-referential. We interpret life from the or wherever we happen to be drawing our identity from. And then we all pull in our own directions. And as Father Thomas Keating said, no wonder the world is in such a mess when there's 7 billion of us doing this. This is not to say that the mind of itself is bad, as much as to notice how dominant and repetitive it can be, and how heavily our stories can sit on us. Sometimes it feels like a leaden weight pushing us down. So we have to slowly learn to let go of the narrow, torturous version of whatever our minds are telling us about who we are, who God is, and what life is about, and become more present here and now to what is real. And it's really interesting, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the name God gave when Moses asked who sent him was I am. God is the ultimate present one, here and now. And contemplative prayer is about learning to be present, open, and awake to this presence. And in this way, we can begin to draw from this presence as the source of our true compassion and wisdom. So this is not some self-absorbed, navel-gazing kind of way of being. It's coming to a still point, which brings us into alignment with God as our true self, and therefore with the world around us. And there's some very helpful tools for learning to be more present. And I touch on some of these in the book, for example, practices like mindfulness, centering prayer, and meditation. However, any of you who have practiced meditation or quiet prayer will know how incredibly difficult it is. Because our minds wander off like children down a sweetie aisle all over the place. And this is where we need to learn the art of self-compassion. And this is the second practice that I want to touch on today. And here I have to quote one of my favorite teachers, James Finlay, who expresses so beautifully this area of learning self-compassion. And so this is how he writes. Even with your most sincere efforts, you are likely to experience just how inept we human beings can be at such a simple, fundamental thing as being simply present in this present moment. Truth is, meditation has a way of laying bare our poverty. We start out with the sincere intention to be present, open, and awake, only to discover that the very simplicity of the intention reveals the wayward complexity of our mind and heart. And he goes on to say, this is why the prevailing attitude of meditation is to have non-judgmental compassion for yourself. As we learn to see others through the eyes of Christ-like compassion, we learn to see ourselves through those same eyes of Christ-like compassion as well. And so what I've learned in my faltering efforts at living a life of contemplative and relevant engagement in the world is that being inept at anything we want to be better at, particularly with the difficult practice of staying present, is actually important. It's important that we fail. As it's by facing our human frailty and waywardness honestly that we learn humility and a gentleness and compassion towards ourselves and therefore towards others. This is such a fundamental area to learn to practice in. And then the third aspect I want to look at today is participation. And I believe that each moment of life is profoundly filled with grace. But the question is, how do we learn to dance in step with life? We need to learn to participate with this grace so that we can wake up to the freedom and spacious aliveness that is possible, that is already here. And in my book, I refer to this as the dance of grace and participation. The process of spiritual awakening is not something we can control or even understand. It's more like learning the subtle art of being led in an exquisite dance, surrendering ourselves to our divine dance partner. However, because our perspective is so small and self-referential, we cannot begin to imagine the wonder of the flow of the dance of life the beauty that is possible. So everything in us wants to take control, to lead the dance in the way it should be danced, damn it. And frankly, the divine dance partner has some odd moves and strange twirls that we just don't think belong. So because of our ridiculously strong urge to be in charge of our lives, even though all evidence points to the fact that we aren't very good at it and can't control the future at all, we have to learn a completely different way of responding to life. It's a subtle art of learning to recognize the flow of grace, easing our grip on control, and learning to surrender to the moment. In this way, we can gradually wake up to the beauty of the dance. And this subtle art is too deep and confusing for the mind, so it involves disciplined practice and guidance, developing an intuition and a kind of a muscle memory for surrender. The choreography of the dance requires much more room to move than our cramped, self-absorbed narratives and identities can allow. But because we tend to hold to these so tightly, the awakening sometimes needs a fierce, searing kind of grace to melt away our tight constrictions that keep us trapped in our prison of self. A deep level of attunement and trust has to be developed in order for us to abandon ourselves to the more unpredictable and at times destabilizing movements of this dance. And this time that we're in now is potentially enormously destabilizing, not only to our sense of health and wellness, but also economically and socially, as the terrible injustice and inequality of our systems are laid bare. Change is inevitable, it has to be, and we find this scary. We fear change and uncertainty. But this is precisely where learning to entrust ourselves to the divine dance is so important. And Alan Watts wrote, "The only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance." If we can dare to do this, we may find ourselves danced into being part of a new emergence, as all of creation stands on tiptoe, waiting for us to wake up to what Mary Oliver calls our place in the family of things. One of the best tutors for the art of living is life itself. And I believe we can learn a lot from people who openly and honestly reflect on life in all of its beauty and pain. And so in this book, I draw on a variety of sources, including musicians such as Leonard Cohen and Alanis Morissette, so profound, and poets such as Rumi, Hafiz, and Mary Oliver. And other guides that I draw on are Christian mystics and teachers like Thomas Merton, James Finlay, Cynthia Bourgeois, and Richard Rohr, who have all had a huge impact on my life. And I also draw on other wisdom teachers from other traditions like Tara Brach, Thich Nhat Hanh, Pema Chodron, and Eckhart Tolle. In the book, I also reflect on my own personal struggles and realizations in the hope that these will resonate with other people's lived experiences as fellow pilgrims. And so I thought I'd read an example of one of my personal reflections that I've written about in this book. I've recently had the privilege of traveling to various Southern African rural communities in Zimbabwe, Tanzania, and Mozambique for an evaluation project that I've been involved with. This project mostly involved work with out-of-school or unemployed youth from extremely disadvantaged areas, many of whom are orphaned or HIV positive. This was a wonderful opportunity to meet people who I would never ordinarily have had the chance to meet. It was also very difficult in terms of seeing the depth of suffering, poverty, and hopelessness that many youth are facing in Southern African countries. The people I met and the oppressive socio-political contexts in some of the countries weighed heavily on me. Immediately after one of these trips, I traveled to the USA for the Living School Week Intensive. On one of the mornings, Richard Raw encouraged us to do a contemplative walk in nature, dialoguing with some aspect of nature and just seeing where that takes us. Although it was summer with green grass and trees, my eyes kept being drawn to the dry, brown, abandoned leaves lying on the grass. And this filled me with an overwhelming sense of despair about the abandoned lives I had just seen. The lost dreams and hopes of those young people, and the abandoned places in myself that I had been recognizing and working with at the time. And it felt like those leaves strongly echoed all of this, my own sense of hopelessness that I felt about changing my stuck ego patterns, as well as the sense of hopelessness about the futures of disenfranchised young people in Southern Africa. The leaves that got to me the most with their utter futility were those that had fallen on the tar and the concrete. They weren't even going to form part of the life cycle of nature, but would be discarded far away somewhere. While I was carrying the sense of utter futility and hopelessness in my heart, I was reminded of a remarkable poem titled The Healing Time by Pesha Joyce Gertler. Finally, on my way to yes, I bump into all the places where I said no to my life, all the untended wounds, the red and purple scars, those coded messages that send me down the wrong street again and again. And I lift them one by one close to my heart, and I say, holy, holy. And so on this meditation walk, as my tear-flooded eyes fell on these dry, abandoned leaves, I spoke over each of them, holy, holy. And as I did this, I had a sense of saying this to my memory of each of the faces of the youth I had encountered, and to my troubled, beloved country, South Africa, and to my own lost, wounded self. This was a deeply sacred and healing moment, although no answers came. On a personal level, it felt like an invitation to hold the parts of myself that feel abandoned, out of place, and hopelessly lost. It also felt like an invitation to hold the unanswered questions, broken lives, and painful contradictions of the Southern African countries as sacred, not as problems to be solved or people to be blamed, but as holy ground to be walked on in humility and to be engaged in fully, to allow myself to simply be here, present and open-hearted on this holy ground, and to allow the sacred presence to flow through me into this context. What I've learned in recent years is that the invitation to each of us is to dare to become intimate with our lived experience. Not only the outer circumstances, but also our inner terrain. To dare to allow ourselves to receive and experience all of it without prejudice, without clinging or resistance, while learning to not identify with the incessant commentary of the mind. Then we can gradually begin to wake up to the exquisite dance of life that we are part of, and learn to respond to this embrace of grace in harmony and spaciousness from a much bigger frame than our usual small perspective. And so, of course, I'll let Thomas Merton have the last word, as he describes this dance so beautifully. No despair of ours can alter the reality of things or stain the joy of the cosmic dance, which is always there. Indeed, we are in the midst of it, and it is in the midst of us, for it beats in our very blood, whether we want it to or not. Yet the fact remains that we are invited to forget ourselves on purpose cast our awful solemnity to the winds, and join the general dance. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. As always, whenever I listen to you, I'm left feeling really calm and quiet, and I'm sure everybody else is. So I'll hand over now to George. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. Hello, everybody. Thank you, Sharon. It's so nice listening to Sharon reading from the book. I can sit here all afternoon and say, won't you carry on? There's other chapters there as well. Thank you very much, Sharon. Right from the word go, I have to say, this is by no means an impartial review from my side, because I'm really smitten with the book. And not only because it's beautifully written or anything like that, but it is such a practical book that we really use a lot. We promote it whenever people come also to our retreat center. Our friend Magdalene, who lives in the Karoo, she's part of this conversation this afternoon. She says she hands Sharon's book out like Smarties. Wherever she meets somebody or whatever, she hands it out, because it's such a wonderful guide. Almost, I'm a little bit hesitant to say manual, but it's a manual for daily contemplative living, and in that sense, it's so practical. So why do I love the book so much? I think it stems from the fact that over the past few years, there has been a major change in the sense that the contemplative spirituality has moved more to the foreground. Contemplative spirituality has always been there. It has been part of the Christian tradition. It's a very important part, but it was usually way in the background. A very small stream within the bigger tradition, and partly the reason for that was the fact that it was mostly done by people in closed orders who only focused on the contemplative journey and contemplative spirituality. But gradually over time, and I think to a large extent because the time is ripe for it, contemplative spirituality moved out of these enclosures, and it became part of the general spirituality of ordinary people, if I can use that word. So in other words, you don't have to be a contemplative or somebody, a monk or a nun in an enclosed cloister or anything like that. It's part of daily living. And somebody who played a huge role, because it's not concepts and ideas that's for the Western mind easily digestible. It's in a lot of ways, it's counterintuitive and it's countercultural, the contemplative journey. And so it's difficult for us in the Western mind to really get a grasp of it or to make it part of our living. And somebody who played a huge role in this sense was Richard Rohr, because he translated these concepts and these ideas to make it accessible. You read it and you say, but it's so simple, it's so that's the way it is. So he played a huge role in that sense. But coming back now to Sharon's book, it's as if Sharon takes Richard's concepts, and it's not only Richard. I mean, there's such a lot of other wonderful authors there as well. But she takes that and she takes it further and she makes it even more practical. And when you read the book, because she shares from her diary entries, her journal, you with her on a journey. It's not something out there. It's she takes you by the hand and she takes you on this journey. And it becomes very tangible, very practical. Something that you say, yes, I can see how it plays out and I can see the effect that it has in your life. And in that sense, it's a wonderful book. Sharon often uses the term the divine dance. It's a term that she loves. And in the book, this dance, it takes many forms. There's the dance between theory and practice. Sharon knows the theory, if we can call it that. She's well read. She knows these authors. She's steeped into that. But then the practice, how to bring it down to earth, how to live theory and practice. Also experience and scripture and tradition. There's constantly this crossing of edges and borders and bringing things together. Because she writes so much from experience, the book is so grounded. I think it's always a danger with the contemplative spirituality that it becomes airy-fairy, a little bit once removed from our daily activities and experiences. And Sharon, she manages to bring it in so into our lives through her own experiences that it becomes really, really grounded. And the matter of using scripture, I love the way Sharon uses scripture and interprets scripture from with a contemplative view. It helped me so much in reading through the book, the passages that she explained or delved into deeper through that. It is wonderful to see how they open up. And I've said on a previous occasion to Sharon, I think her next book should be a translation or something around the Psalms, because she takes those Psalms and she writes it in a contemplative prayer form that helps me so much when I read it. And when I read her interpretation of the scripture passages in the book, it really helps me in getting more of a grip and a deep understanding, not on a head level, but on a heart level of what is God busy doing here. And coming more from a Protestant tradition, it's lovely to experience that where the soul or the heart speaks very much in the interpretation of scripture. Another aspect of the dance and the crossing of borders or distinctions is the crossing of distinctions between different disciplines. Sharon comes from a world of physics, and when she talks about that, she knows about these things. But she's so comfortable in the world of spirituality. So it's all these things that come together, and it shows you how this world that we live in and all the activities that we engage in is part of God's reality. It plays in so beautifully with that quote by Paula Darcy, who says, God comes to us disguised as our lives. And when Sharon writes, you see God in all his disguises in life. And that is what I really love about that. So in closing, it's a wonderful, practical book that we use often. It's a very handy manual to give people, to hand it to people and say, if you want to start on this journey, this can help you immensely. And to take it from there. And for that reason, on the bedstand next to my bed, I have the Sasol Birds of Southern Africa, and I have Sharon's book. So those two books are my practical guides in living. So I'm very, very grateful for Sharon for taking the leap and writing this book. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, George.